Okay, I'm going to get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar. Super excited to have you all. My name is Olivia, and I'm the Director of Programs for the Clio Institute. And today I'm joined by two very special guests, Mario Ariza, who is the author of the new book, Disposable City, Miami's Future on the Shores of a Climate Catastrophe. Mario is going to be doing a short reading and discussing the content of his book. Thank you, Mario. And I'm also joined by Alex Harris, who's the climate change reporter for the Miami Herald, and she's going to help moderate our discussion and our Q&A section at the end. So before we get started, I just want to do a quick intro and go over a little bit of housekeeping things. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, so you will all get a link to the recording next week in a follow-up email, as well as all of the other items that we include, like resources and links. We will be using the Q&A function, so if you just look down at the bottom of your Zoom webinar toolbar, you'll see Q&A. You can put all of your questions there. But we will be using the chat function. I'm going to be sharing links and resources to keep an eye out for that. And if we do experience any technical difficulties, we just ask that you bear with us while we get things sorted out. So for those of you who don't know, the Clio Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Miami with offices in Tallahassee and Orlando. And we are solely dedicated to climate change education and advocacy. So through our webinars, our trainings, our workshops, and our programs that are aimed at different audiences, we are trying to get our community to connect the dots on climate change, but also to figure out ways, help them find ways to take action, either individually at home or in their community. So I don't know about you, but lately I've been seeing a lot of worrisome headlines in the news, right? We've been hearing about the Back Bay study, record-breaking heat, updated hurricane season, major fish die-offs just recently. And for me, this is really just bringing attention to the fact that our area is really vulnerable to climate change impacts. And in fact, Florida is the most vulnerable state in the US to the impacts of climate change, and in particular, South Florida. So while we are vulnerable and while we are experiencing one of the biggest pandemics, which is compounding a lot of the climate change impacts, we are a very resilient community. I've also been noticing lately that our community has been rising to the challenge and has been pushing for better climate policy at the local and at the state level. So there's a lot to be grateful for. And I'm hoping that once we get into the discussion portion today in the Q&A, that we can frame the discussion from a solution standpoint, right? How can we get more involved? What are some things that we can do as individuals for our homes, but also for our communities? So I don't want to take up too much time. I'm gonna let you take it over, Alex, if you want to do a quick intro, and then we'll hand it over to Mario. You're on mute, Alex.
Thanks. Okay, I fixed it. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're really glad to have you, and I think this is a really important conversation to have. That I'm really glad we could have Mario here to talk about his book. Many of you who've lived here for a while know him from his writing about climate change. He did a lot of work with the New Tropic a couple of years back, and some really excellent, groundbreaking stories about the ways that climate change affects us now. Some stuff about septic tanks, stuff about climate gentrification, really impactful reporting that he has since propelled into an entire book that is, I can say, excellent. And it's really unique because there's a lot of books written about climate change in Miami. There's a lot written about it, but very few come from the perspective that Mario has, which is somebody who grew up here and loves this place and wants it to succeed and wants it to exist in 80 years. So I'm really excited to hear him read part of his book today. I think you guys are going to enjoy it just as much as I did and just as much as I've seen lots of people online talk about. So Mario, will you take it away?
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks so much to the Clio Institute for having us and Alex for moderating this discussion. I really appreciate it. So I never know what part of the book to read, and I wish I could kind of like take a poll at the beginning. But I'm just going to read the part about my grandmother's 80th birthday party. But you know what? Maybe I can read the part about the septic tanks, because we're all talking about the fish kill right now. So I'll read the part about the septic tank, because we're all talking about the fish kill right And what you have to know is that back in 2016, I went along with a septic tank company to pump out a septic tank as kind of like a ride along. And I still can't get the smell out of my nose. Like I can still smell the smell. So anyways, the septic tank. In the Redlands, Carly Lorenzo's house smells foul. A noxious brown liquid is bubbling up from the kitchen drain of her single-family home. A nauseating odor hits you as soon as you open the door. Located far out to the south and west in the Redlands and unincorporated Miami-Dade County, her residence was a swamp less than 80 years ago. Today, it stinks like one. It smells atrocious, she complains. Lorenzo's septic tank is backed up. She's had to call the plumbers today to have it pumped. This time of year, I see this kind of thing every day, says Angel Rosario, the salty, sweaty owner of a Better Aim Septic Incorporated. And he will be seeing a lot more of it in the future. That's because climate change is set to cripple South Florida's septic systems. Ever more intense rainstorms and rising seas are increasing water ground levels in the region, flooding out systems like Lorenzo's much more frequently. The problem is vast. There are 108,000 property parcels in Miami-Dade County served by septic tanks. Currently, 56% of them can be considered compromised during intense storms or in wet years. That means they stop doing their job and instead start leaching nasty stuff into the groundwater and letting it back up into drains, as Lorenzo is unfortunately experiencing firsthand. And all that nasty stuff ends up in the bay. The county expects the number of compromised systems to balloon up to 64% within the next 25 years. The solution is expensive. According to studies conducted by the county, bringing the 108,000 properties in Miami-Dade without sewer access into the system might cost $3.3 billion. It's the middle of the rainy season when I visit Lorenzo's house, and shortly before her septic tank backed up, a month's worth of rain fell in 1 week. Rosario is halfway through the process of pumping out the overflowing septic tank when the groundwater starts pouring in. When the water table rises and you get saturation from the rain, the water has nowhere else to go but back into the septic system, says Rosario. That's why you're getting that heavy fecal smell. And there was a heavy fecal smell. A backed up septic tank is a normal occurrence for the 30% of Floridians who treat their wastewater that way. The systems have to be regularly pumped for proper maintenance anyway, but, open quote, areas where the ground elevation is low relative to sea level are going to be increasingly at risk to drain field failures, warns Doug Yoder, Deputy Director of Miami-Dade's Water and Sewer Department, though Yoder cautions that there's no way to know if sea level rise is the culprit in Lorenzo's case. Side note, Yoder is a really nice guy. Septic tanks are typically installed in zones where it's not practical or cost effective for local governments to put in a traditional sewer system. In South Florida, the breakneck pace of post-war development made the septic tank the go-to option for treating the waste of a rapidly expanding city. The tanks function by collecting wastewater in impermeable tubs and just kind of letting it sit there for a while. Gravity does the work of separating out the solids, that's poop, and pulling the liquid out into the septic drain field where it slowly gets filtered through the soil. But increasing global temperatures are reducing the effectiveness of the anaerobic bacteria that do the filtering. And anyway, for tanks to even work, they require at least a foot of clearance between drain field and groundwater, explains Yoder. According to county estimates, by 2040, significant portions of Miami-Dade will experience groundwater levels within a half foot of the soil's surface for more than 25% of the year. Lower lying areas may have to deal with those conditions more than 75% of the year. If that foot of soil between the drain field and the groundwater level isn't there, the system doesn't filter right and might even end up flooding, like Lorenzo's did. That's bad news for surrounding bodies of water, which can become contaminated with high levels of bacteria or suffer toxic algae blooms thanks to nutrients leached from septic tank drain fields. Because South Florida's soil is so porous, rising sea levels push the groundwater level upward. A high water table also makes it harder for precipitation to drain properly. That means that low-flying Florida homes that treat their wastewater with septic tanks might be forced to spend buku bucks switching systems long before the sea starts flooding their living rooms. On average, it costs about $40,000 to $50,000 to hook up an existing residence to the sewer system, explains Yoder. That's partly because installing sewer systems after a property has been built usually involves things like ripping up roads, putting in new water and sewer mains. Developers tend to roll that price of those connections into the total cost of the structure that they build the first time. Where current homeowners in need of a hookup may be left holding the bill for the new connection. The county estimates that extending sewer service to the commercial properties currently on Septic would cost them another $400 million on top of the $3.3 billion. And neither commercial nor residential estimates factored in the cost of additional water treatment plants and pumping stations that would need to be built to handle all the sewage. But before Miami-Dade calls the guy with the shovels and the whips at the checkbook, it has to determine whether people are stay in the homes it's considering extending sewer service to. You don't particularly want to invest what could be a very large amount of money to provide centralized sewer service if people are going to pick up and leave because of frequent flooding, Yoder cautions. So Lorenzo has a choice to make when it comes to the cost of fixing her septic tank. She can pay Rosario, the plumber, $250 for just a pump out, or she can plunk down a cool $4,000 to get her drain field fixed. We're moving away as soon as my daughter graduates high school, she tells me, before handing Rosario the smaller sum. All right, and that's a short little section.
Thank you, Mario. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the book itself and sort of what it covers? I haven't had the opportunity yet to read it, and I do look forward to reading it, but just to give a little bit of context to those who are on the webinar who haven't had the opportunity to read the book.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so Disposable City, Miami's Future on the Shores of Climate Catastrophe is a book designed to take people from 0 to 100 on what climate change is going to do here in South Florida. And it's told very directly from my point of view, right? From the point of view of somebody who grew up here and is very much wondering if he's going to be able to stay. And it's sort of organized around that question, right? Like, what does society here, what do the humans here have to do to be able to still live here with 2, 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise, increased temperatures, and lots of sewage sloshing around? So, you know, that's the sort of big frame for the book. But the book is also very specifically designed to try and give people a working knowledge of most of the major environmental issues that occur in Florida. And you're like, oh, well, all right, that doesn't sound too exciting. And like, yeah, you know, that doesn't sound too exciting, but like, in order to try and talk about what happens to the Everglades, I kind of like, in a very hungover fashion, go python hunting and then tell you about it, which is like something I recommend never doing. Like, please be well hydrated when you're python hunting. Or I take a leaky kayak up the Miami River and I go on all these like sorts of weird adventures, just trying to figure out what our vulnerabilities are and how we might fix them. And I ended up talking to hundreds of people for this project, some of which are here. I ended up relying on the reporting of Alex Harris and other people at the Herald, which, if you don't have a subscription, subscribe today, please, very heavily, and sort of trying to bring together all of the different strands of what climate change is going to do here in one place, right? So all you need to do is sit down and read this book, and it will empower you to start making the right decisions, hopefully personally and on a societal and civic society level, to kind of advocate for your own interests here in South Florida. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you
I talk a
for
lot
that
about
description.
poop, but you know.
Well, it's certainly part of the problem. I just wanted to ask, do you talk about solutions in the book? Or are you more framing just mostly some of the like very local issues that we're experiencing?
No, the book is organized around this principle called the narrow path, right? And the narrow path is like the really, really narrow path to survival that we have here in South Florida as a society. And the last chapter is devoted entirely to solutions to the crisis, right? And it's everything from, you know, eating less meat and, you know, putting solar panels on your house and driving an electric vehicle, but it's also like, most importantly, breaking up the monopolies that run South Florida and Florida's energy infrastructure. That we right now in Florida we get 70% of our energy from natural gas. There are 5 major energy providers, and it's essentially an oligopoly. And either those folks are going to decide to very quickly transition to renewable energy, or we're going to have an issue. So all of that is in there for sure.
So something I like about your book is that it comes from the perspective of someone who understands the reality of the challenges ahead of us, because I think that's the easy part for most people who write about the issue down here. It's going to be expensive. It's going to take a lot of effort. But what those other narratives often miss, and that you have included, is there are solutions, they are in progress, and there are plenty of people who are trying to push them through. So for instance, septic tanks is one of those wonderful problems that just requires money to fix, right? And I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about the way that when you fix something like septic tanks, switching from septic to sewer, it doesn't just fix one thing. It doesn't just stop polluting the bay. It also makes it healthier for people to live here. It also makes it, more affordable for some people, or there's a lot of things that it could do. Can you talk a little bit about how some of these solutions that are proposed that you talk about in your book are holistic and could affect a lot of parts of Miami?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. In many of the ways that the problems that we're dealing with are like really big and tough and difficult and systemic, right? And really kind of complicated. And it's like one awful thing making a bunch of other things awful. Fixing that one awful thing and getting it right can often make all of the other things either less awful and sometimes even, frankly, not awful at all. So to give a specific example, and let's think clearly about the issue that's facing us today in terms of the fish die-off in the bay, right? Which we don't know exactly where it's coming from, but there is a preponderance of evidence that maybe it has to do with the septic tank situation here in Florida, right? And why do we have septic tanks? We've got septic tanks because that was the cheap way to build. And in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, that's what people put in, right? And we've got laws on the books that could maybe force or make houses, force homeowners to connect to septic, to their sewer systems. We've got a plan for expanding sewer out to people, and it just costs money. And you're like, oh my God, $3.3 billion, that's insane. Right, okay, yes, that's nuts. But if you redo all of the sewer infrastructure, right, for all of those septic tank homes, it also means that it may be a good chance to redo all of the stormwater that's happening there, right? To kind of like fix the drainage for heavy rains. And we know climate change is going to give us heavier rains, right? So in addition to clean water, you're also maybe going to get a benefit where you get your drainage fixed, because the county's digging the hole anyways, might as well fix the stormwater stuff, right? In addition, right, it's not just the immediate benefit of the clean water in the bay, it's also the immediate benefit of the clean water in our canals, right? South Florida lives with its back towards its canals. We've got a gigantic canal system here that we don't really think about using at all. So we've got those two things. And reducing the nutrient load and figuring out an efficient way to, get fresh water into the bay that maybe mimic some of the natural systems involves also us thinking about, how to defend the canal system and how to defend the drainage, right? So it's all interconnected. And one could imagine us doing a lot more, natural solutions involving, perhaps pumps, yes, but some sort of mangrove to get the filtered water out and to filter the water before it hits the bay. And then those mangroves don't just filter the water as a quote unquote bioswale. At the same time, you have a benefit of breaking up wave action in storm surges, right? So if done intelligently, all of these adaptations can create secondary positive benefits. And they also create a lot of jobs, because somebody's going to have to use the shovel.
And while we're talking about natural solutions, that's something that you kind of talk a little bit about in the book, and how they could be used and make a lot of positive changes holistically to the whole county. Do you see a lot of them happening now? Where do you see the best push forward on that issue here?
That's a great question. it's funny because the area where I grew up, so I grew up on 157 Old Cutler, and the county put one of the few, I think the South Florida Water Management District did this, correction, one of the few sort of like natural solution systems to the issues that we're talking about down there that I've seen, right? It's this pump, it's this pond, and it sort of pumps water naturally into the bay rather than using a salinity barrier like they do in all of the other canal heads, right? And it's beautiful. Like my little brother John Paul would go and fish there, right? I'm kind of jealous that they built this after I left to college because he had, the joy of enjoying it. I don't necessarily see that being considered in many of the major overhauls that are being talked about, since there's very little of the use of blue-green infrastructure solutions in the plan that the Army Corps of Engineers has put forward, the Back Bay study. And I think a lot of the comments that have gone into this study have been like, hey, maybe instead of a 12-foot wall, we could build mangroves out with a wall in the mangroves or something like that. So that's a possibility. There's also, I think you did some really cool articles about some stuff in Coconut Grove that they were considering swales to deal with drainage as an issue.
Yeah, they've been floated. Miami Beach is actually moving forward with a bioswale, which is turn one of the swales everybody likes to park right now in a very flood-prone neighborhood, and they're going to replace it with some landscaping and some drainage, and it'll hopefully absorb some flood water. And the city of Miami is also working on some living shorelines and future parks. But I would like to back up. Can you talk about what the Back Bay study is and what it could mean for our community? Just maybe an intro if anyone hasn't heard of it.
Yes. So if you haven't heard of the Back Bay study yet, this is like the $4.4 billion, $4.9 billion, $4.4 billion, yeah, $4 billion plan to kind of like save Miami from one of the shocks and stresses of a climate change world. And it's a very specific plan to save Miami from the big one. And the big one is the hurricane that comes in with a giant storm surge and knocks out the port, the airport, the downtown, and causes, could cause $1 trillion loss in terms of just like moving a storm surge up the Miami River and into Little Havana, which is very vulnerable. So what the Army Corps of Engineers has essentially proposed, among other things, sorry, I'm getting a phone call from Topeka, Kansas. I don't know who it is. I'm not going to answer. So what the folks at the Army Corps of Engineers have proposed are, placing storm surge barriers, physical walls up and down certain sections of Miami coast, right? There's a wall in Edgewater that's been proposed. There's a deployable storm surge barrier at the mouth of the Miami River that's been proposed. And lo and behold, there's also a proposal for a 13-foot tall wall in the middle of Biscayne Bay. Like 10, not in the middle, 10, I think it's 50 feet off from the shore in Brooklyn. Just going to, do great things for people's water views. So the plan definitely has an issue in terms of like, okay, they're going to have to take people's homes to build these walls to protect the rest of the city. Are these walls really the best way to go about it? But the plan also has like deeper philosophical issues in the sense that it uses a cost-benefit analysis to figure out where to do adaptations or not. And you're like, well, duh, of course you're using a cost-benefit where to do adaptations or not. But like, if you're doing cost-benefit analyses for adaptations, you're going to end up doing adaptations and hardening the infrastructure and the houses of the people who have the most money. So there's a concern that, for instance, Golden Beach, which as lovely as it is, y'all in Golden Beach don't need any more money, is going to get a bunch of home hardening, whereas other less well-to-do sections of the city or of the area are not going to get, their homes adapted and turned into, flood-resistant areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think the equity considerations are really important, and it's something we've seen Clio has taken a stance on, and a lot of other community groups have submitted comments. And as you see in the chat, you too can submit a comment if you have any opinions on what you'd like to see, what you wouldn't like to see. The county got an extension on public comments, so it ends August 19th. They only accept them via email, which is wonderfully in the chat right there. And there's been, I mean, a lot of journalism about it. I've done some, WLRN has done some, NBC6 has. There's a lot to be said about this potential, the good potential and the bad potential of this program. I mean, what you hear from local adaptation specialists is not often does the federal government come knocking on your door with billions of dollars. So this is an opportunity, as we keep hearing, to shape potentially the huge, most gigantic investment in resilience Miami's ever seen into something that is equitable, respects the environment, and also, you know, actually hardens us in the future. But maybe you could talk a little bit, Mario, about one of the main critiques we see, which is that there are none of those, well, there are very few of those natural-based solutions that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Yeah, they're not particularly popular. And part of the reason I think has to deal with the fact that the majority of our shoreline is private property, right? You have the beaches, of course, but in terms of, if you think, where does the city meet the ocean? Most of the time it's at the back of, you know, a pretty well-to-do person's home. And what do you find there? You find a seawall. And that seawall is regulated and governed by both county, federal, and state ordinances. And so the sort of stuff that would have to change for people to, you know, replace their seawalls with a specially built kind of mangrove seawall mixture, right? For instance, that's a lot of regulation that has to be cut through, right? And has to be kind of redesigned and redreamt of. And not a lot of people get excited about that, which, you know, is astounding to me. But in addition to that, drainage and rain is going to be a really, really big issue. And as you see, you know, City Miami Beach, as Alex mentioned, and City Miami kind of testing out these bioswales, if the data is there to support their efficacy, I mean, this could be a really kind of positive way for us to learn to live with the water, in the sense that if we learn how to collect and drain the water with, you know, soft, permeable ground that is planted with trees, not only do we, you know, not get that water dirty with a lot of stuff from the road, but at the same time, we reduce our temperatures, right? Because that tree cover and that grass is gonna actually reduce the dew points and the temperatures where it's placed. And more importantly, also, you know, it may lead to some carbon sequestration, which we're certainly going to need a lot of. So the more you sort of dive into the issue of like how we adapt our city, the more, you know, you start seeing that there's a set of tools that perhaps aren't being picked up or used as often enough because they're a little new. They might seem a little new agey, like, you know, they want to like burn some incense and do some yoga next year, but that's fine. Because like these things do apparently seem to work pretty well and are worth heavy consideration.
So speaking of living with water and some of these newer solutions, I want to pivot to some of the questions we've gotten in the chat. A couple people have talked about climate-driven displacement and climate gentrification. Veronica wants to know if you talk about climate gentrification in the book, and an anonymous viewer wants to know if you think climate-driven displacement is real and how should it be prevented?
Yes, okay. So I spend 2 to 3 chapters talking about climate gentrification in this book. And I do think that climate gentrification is a real phenomena. And in fact, in this book, I have on the record the attorney for the Magic City Innovation District saying that they're building the Innovation District on the high ground because it's resilient, right? Which is sort of like a not so tacit admission on their part that they're engaging in climate gentrification. Though I think they would characterize it differently. I would characterize it as such. Okay.
Really quickly,
yes,
what do you define define climate gentrification as before you talk a little bit about the effects, just so we're all on the same page?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So in Miami, climate gentrification takes a specific form. Okay. In other cities, it's going to look different. But here, because of the way that the city grew, right, and because of racist redlining practices that did not allow people of certain races to live in certain areas, most of Miami's minorities in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and in the 30s were not allowed to live close to the coast. They were put on the high ground, on the Atlantic coastal ridge next to the railroad. And so nobody wanted that land as much. And that's cool until the ocean starts rising. And all of a sudden that land becomes much more desirable. So neighborhoods like Liberty City, Little Haiti, Miami Gardens, now all of a sudden you're starting to see an increase in the property value there because speculators are coming in, purchasing homes and flipping them, right? And they're not selling these homes to the people that are originally from those neighborhoods. They're selling that house to what would be termed gentrifiers, right? And in addition to that low-level speculation that's been going on for a long time, there's high-level development that's happening in these neighborhoods where people want to come in and using a section of the city code, right, of the laws that let you build stuff here, they want to build large, dense developments on the high ground. Now, large, dense developments on the high ground are what need to happen in part for Miami to survive, right? We need to figure out a way to get a lot of people onto the safe area. But if these dense developments aren't equitable, if we don't figure out how to share the high ground, then what you're doing is you're displacing the folks that was redlined there originally onto the low ground, right? Because we think a lot of these people are leaving to homestead, but we don't have very good data on that. Hopefully someday we will, hopefully soon. And so that leads to a cycle where those folks may, within 30 years, be displaced from homestead because homestead is very low lying. Right? So that's climate gentrification, if that makes sense. I followed the struggle of folks in Little Haiti. I follow Marlene Bastien's struggle against Magic City Innovation District, which is still a plan to build a 25-story housing development in the middle of a single-story neighborhood. I follow, talk with Nina Jagannath as she tries to, do some legal maneuvering to keep that project from happening. I try to talk to city commissioners. I go to the city commission, and I really try and understand what it is about Miami's racial history that's keeping us from sharing the high ground in an equitable fashion. And you read the book to find out, because it's kind of a hard answer to give just talking. But yeah, it's definitely for me a very real issue. It's deeply tied to the questions of equity and climate justice that a lot of folks are raising and dealing with. And it's also deeply tied to one of the main ways in which distinct economic outcomes are forced upon people of different races in this particular city, right? Because people of different races were not given equal access to land, right? And they were not given equal access to capital in order to develop that land. And now that historical inequity is being taken advantage of in order for some people to get a little bit of respite from the rising sea. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. And these kind of entangled, like you discussed, inequities that are sort of building on each other and magnifying each other as the climate crisis intensifies are sort of horrifying when you think about them. And the follow-up to one of these questions that were asked about climate gentrification or climate-driven displacement is solutions. Do we have any? If so, what are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a whole suite of policy solutions that politicians and decision makers could put into place to ensure that the high ground gets shared equitably, right? There's this not very radical concept called workforce housing, which forces developers to build a certain amount of housing that is not going to be at market rate, but that's going to be affordable to people at certain income levels when they build their giant big development, right? And that means that you have mixed income communities when those developers build. In 2018, there was an ordinance before the county that proposed just such a thing. It was shut down in large part because of lobbying by housing developers, right? And the title of my book comes from a conversation with one of those housing developers. You can read the conversation that started the book. But essentially, after talking with him, I felt like the city was being treated disposably. So that's one easy policy solution that could be quickly implemented that would build more equitably shareable housing on the high ground, right? Like if you listen to the people who were trying to fight against the Magic City Innovation District, one of their main complaints was that, like, okay, they're going to do some workforce housing, but it's not even going to be in the area where the innovation is built. It's just going to be like a pool of money and we don't know what's going to happen. So that was a problem. There are other ways to solve this issue, especially in Miami. Okay, so in Miami, you have as much high ground north as you do south of the Miami River. And nobody's talking about this, right? But the high ground south of the Miami River is single family homes of a completely different socioeconomic bracket, right? And you don't see those getting gentrified. You also don't see those getting densified. If you change the zoning in those areas from single family home zoning to multifamily units, right? And this is the discussion that is happening in other American cities in the West Coast, such as Portland and San Francisco, which have huge housing crises. If you change those densification rates on that southern high ground, you could ideally alleviate the pressure from the northern high ground. And at the same time, like the folks in the southern high ground may have the money themselves to develop their own properties into multifamily units if they see a financial incentive to do so. So, you know, it could be a free market win there, right?
That's a really good point. And it also kind of mirrors like the way that you can lean on the private sector for solutions, or you can lean on the government for solutions, which community groups like Clio have advocated for solutions like freezing property taxes until the property is sold, just so that you can maintain what's already there, that naturally occurring affordable housing in places like Little Haiti and Liberty City and Allapattah. So people can stay in their homes. And there are two research moments going on right now. The city of Miami is studying solutions policy-wise to climate gentrification. They have yet to come up with any solutions that they've presented to anyone. And also the University of Miami, well, they're working on it. And the University of Miami also got a pretty good grant from JP Morgan recently, and they've been studying policies that would, you know, maintain affordable housing in higher elevation properties. So those are the two ongoing research efforts, but as you mentioned, a lot of these involve pretty big lever pulls from the government. And maybe that's a good way for us to segue into political will.
If I could just pause 1 second there,
sure.
as if any researchers or I don't know, reporters are hanging out in this conversation, one of the things that really accelerates gentrification in a particular neighborhood is fines from the city, right? For not having your garbage out, for not having your roof fixed, for not having your house the color, you know, that it's supposed to, right? And sometimes those fines can push a vulnerable family or a vulnerable homeowner into selling the house because they don't think they're going to be able to fix it or afford the fine, right? Those fines are public record. And I think that there is just kind of a research project sitting there looking at the disparate application by the city of Miami and by other municipal entities onto or of these fines in areas that they want to develop and gentrify, right? So that's something that needs some watchdog right there. But anyways, keep going.
No, great point. And actually, there are some related questions in the chat we're going to jump to. So someone, Dorian wants to know, what neighborhoods are the southern high grounds located in? So maybe name some names.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Shenandoah, sections of South Miami, certainly, sections of Coral Gables, certainly, but they're not gonna, you know. So the ridge goes, you know, just kind of like this, and it's there. And if you look at a map, I mean, there are sections of Little Havana that are high ground too, and most of it isn't the city of Miami, right? Like you have you have South Miami and Coral Gables, right? And those are the sort of two big other cities that are dealing with this, or that are sitting on that high ground. But if you could get densification ordinances passed in those cities, then you know you could see some solutions there.
And another great question from the chat. Veronica wants to know, are there any areas of the Bay, Florida, or world that you can identify as a model of what we should be doing here in South Florida?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Is anybody getting it right?
That's the question.
Yeah, Veronica, I don't know. I actually think we're gonna have to be one of the first people to get it right here, because like we're literally, at least in the developed world, we're the tip of the spear, right? Which is not to say that if you don't go to like Vanuatu or the Seychelles Archipelago or the Sundarbans of Bangladesh, right? If you don't go to the really vulnerable areas, that you won't find stuff to learn there, right? And there's also a lot to learn from the Dutch, right? And the Dutch will obviously teach you, but they'll have to charge because they make 2% of their GDP from selling engineering knowledge for adaptation. So there's other people who are doing it. There's other people who are facing the challenge. I don't know of any other area around the world that has our unique geology, in the sense that I don't think anybody else had the, we'll call it foresight, to build a city on permeable limestone. And so everybody else kind of has access to different sorts of adaptation tools. We were kind of limited in that sense. In terms of other American cities that are dealing with similar issues, New Orleans is dealing with a lot of similar issues. Charleston, South Carolina is dealing with a lot of similar issues. So those are some other areas to look at in the States too.
And a couple of these questions are kind of more about the process that writing and reporting this book. So Umbretta wants to know how long ago you started working on the book. And she and Sarah also want to know, was there anything you found shocking or surprising in your research for this book?
Yeah. So I guess the story that I'm telling about how the book started is that like I kind of had started reporting about Miami and its vulnerability, and then went to this like writers conference in Portland. It was sort of like a business convention for writers, which is just as boring as it sounds. And there was this editor of this press, and it was after a reading, and I was kind of drunk, and I wouldn't shut up about septic tanks in Miami and climate change. And I think in order to like get me out of his hair, he was like, "You should write a book proposal about that." And I'm like, "What's a book proposal?" And this was in 2016. And he ended up, suggesting that I write a book proposal. And then I called a friend of mine who was an agent. He's like, "This is how you write a book proposal." And I wrote a book proposal, and then he denied the book proposal. But, eventually the book got sold in 2018. And then it took a year to write it. But this was a kind of a 4-year process, if I'm being honest with everybody. So that's one thing. I think one of the strangest or most shocking things that I learned while writing the book, and it's something that you see every now and again in the headlines, but it's kind of a hard thing to be cognizant of, right? And it's that healthy ecosystems tend to absorb carbon dioxide, whereas ecosystem destruction or unhealthy ecosystems tend to emit carbon dioxide. And if our ultimate goal is to reduce the total amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to the point where, I don't know, humans and their civilization can survive, especially the one in Miami, then we sort of have to understand that environmental degradation isn't necessarily just a game of, conservation or keeping it pretty for the, the gamesmen or the fishers or the hunters. But like, if you look at what's happening on the edge of the Everglades right now, right, the ocean is rising, and the sawgrass that comprises the Everglades, there's like peat under the sawgrass, and the sawgrass has this long root and it lives in the peat. But as the salt water comes into the peat, it kills off the sawgrass and it dissolves the peat. And all of that ancient carbon stored from the 5,000 years of the Everglades' existence, 6,000 years maybe, goes into the air, right? Goes into the water. And all of a sudden, what was a beautiful wetland becomes the equivalent of like running a lot of cars for a long time, on a freeway. And it's a terrifying thing. Also, like, one thing I've been thinking about recently is there was an Australian study, and I think I shared it in the chat a while ago, about how much CO2 losing an acre of seagrass can extrude into the atmosphere, and how much CO2 creating an acre of seagrass can capture, right? And which gets me thinking, well, okay, Biscayne Bay has lost 80% of its seagrass in the past 10 years. How much CO2 did we put out into the atmosphere without realizing it? Maybe somebody at Erasmus knows the answer.
It's a great question. And it also sort of leads into the next one, which is, you sort of talked about this a little bit, but Louise wants to know, based on your knowledge about the geology, sea level rise, all the factors that you're aware of, how do you envision our greater Miami area by 2100? We were expecting a sea level rise increase of 6 feet or more. What do you think Miami will look like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Louise. I kind of sketched this out a little bit in a very science fiction like end of the book. Also, like ending books is hard, so please be forgiving about that. But there's a chance here for us to figure out how to retreat onto the high ground, right? And how to share that high ground and how to build an urban environment on that high ground that lives with the water when the water is here, right? But that also is a good space for people to live, right? And doesn't necessarily step outside of its ecological boundaries. So that's one thing. I also envision a city that needs to shift its economy, right? Like, as much as I love surfing on South Beach, that beach isn't going to be there for a long time, right? You can steal all the sand that you want from the Bahamas, but at 3 to 4 feet of sea level rise, like, that's just not going to be there. So we have to think of something different other than tourism, and we really do have to think of something different other than real estate, right? Because the tourism without the real estate doesn't really work. And the real estate, well, soggy houses don't sell very well. So I see an area that has figured out adaptation and sells adaptation services. I also think that this is an area that has a lot to offer in terms of logistics and being a key connection point to Latin America. And I think that, you know, if we double down on the fact that we have the largest air cargo airport in the world right here in our backyard, we can generate industrial capacity through aviation that will make us less dependent on tourism and on real estate. But there's a lot that we're going to have to learn in terms of technological advancement, and there's a lot that we're going to have to learn in terms of living with each other in an equitable, just society for the city to be able to survive. And to be frank, right, like one of the big questions out there is, how do we return a lot of the land that is soon going to be water to, you know, nature with some sort of responsibility, right? Like, you can't just abandon a neighborhood for water. That's going to be awful. So is there a way that we can generate? And, you know, I've got a little bit of disaster tourism in the back of the book about that. So those are the sort of things that I think about and I envision. This is going to be a very different city. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be a city. I think it does have a chance of surviving. And I think with every gigaton of CO2 that humanity can keep from pumping into the atmosphere, our chances of surviving increase, right? Because that means there's going to be less sea level here. Sea level rise.
On that note, when you talk about, you know, what I liked about the climate fiction you had at the end of your book is what you just said. It's hopeful. It looks to a future where there are solutions, they are being worked on, and they can be accomplished. And, you know, Miami doesn't disappear by 2100. It exists as a fully functioning society that honors what has happened to it and has an economy that can support people. It has affordable housing. Do you turn to that? Caroline wants to know, how do you stay optimistic under the crushing information sometimes of what could happen, worst case scenario in this city? How do you shake that climate grief off and focus on that optimistic future?
That's a great question. And this is going to be sort of like a weird answer in the sense that I don't think, like, so I have a master's in poetry, which is just kind of like a master's in like sitting around and talking about my feelings, right? And I'm very much a believer in, if you feel a feeling, feel the feeling, right? And so what I felt today, for example, when I saw a video shared by a member of our chat, that showed all of these poor little stingrays gasping for breath off of Pelican Harbor, like, that broke my heart, right? And that caused me grief. And I'm gonna sit and feel that feeling, right? Because if I try and shunt it to the side, it's just gonna cause me stress. And so the thing with grief, right, is you always want to put grief off. This is what Laurencia Strauss tells me, what I put in the book, and I think about it all the time. Hi, Laurencia, if you're listening. But don't avoid it. Feel it, right? Like, face the grief. Like, there's a large chance that this city may not make it. There's a large chance that you and I and everybody we know and love here is going to lose a lot in terms of money, in terms of social relations, and it's just going to have to deal with a higher burden of suffering than they otherwise would. And once you face that, and once you sit with it, then a burden well carried is light, and you can walk forward and you can fight the fight, and tell the stories you have to tell. And so yeah, that's my way of dealing with it. I think everybody's going to have a different way of dealing with it, and I'm always happy to talk to people about that particular grief that they're feeling, or any particular grief that they're feeling, because let's face it, it's 2020, and this is a weird time. But that's how I deal with it, and not to say that I deal with it well. Like, sometimes I'm a bore,
Just to add to that, I think, it is important to feel your feelings, and it is important to realize that there is not 100% chance of a sunny future ahead. But what I think you have noticed, and what I've noticed in covering climate change here for so long, is that it's really helpful to know that you're not the only person who's worried about it. And there are people that care deeply and are standing up in city commission, that are forming groups, that are raising their voices, that are advocating for the solutions you and I have talked about this hour. And it's all happening, and it's all happening faster and faster. It feels like now. It feels like every month there's more people who care and are trying to make a difference. And I find that encouraging.
I do really find that encouraging. And I also like that fills my heart. It really does. And like, my mom called me, like, this makes me tear up. My mom called me the other day, and I still have to send this to her. And she's like, Mario, can you send me an environmental voter guide? I'm going to send it to all my friends. And when we go vote, we're going to vote for the people who are going to be real about this problem. And like, she called me, and like, I cried. Because at that point, I was like, okay, wow, people are getting it. People are understanding. And so that is a way to sort of leaven the grief. It really is. And it's also the way that this gets fixed, right? This gets fixed through community. It gets fixed through civic society. It gets fixed through like honest discourse and participation, and us realizing that we can do this if we do it together.
Thank you so much, Mario. Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. I've really enjoyed today's conversation. Mario, I'm blown away by the depth of your knowledge and detail. I'm actually really looking forward to reading your book. Can you let us know where the book is available? Maybe I can share a link in the follow-up email with all of those who participated on today's webinar. You can put it in the chat if you'd like, if you have a particular link. But I want to just reemphasize, when we talk about, like, when I showed some of those headlines earlier that we've been seeing in the community, I want to counter that by saying that for me personally, the overwhelming, burden that it can be to be in this field, I counter it by taking action. So one of the things that I've learned just personally by being part of Clio's team is becoming more civically engaged. And it sounds really cheesy, but it's the only way to make change happen in our community. We really have to voice our concerns, and it takes effort, it takes energy, it takes going outside your comfort zone, speaking at a commission meeting, submitting comments, not being shy, having to go out there. So we have to push ourselves because it's really a community effort. And a lot of the different problems that you've brought up today, that all of you have discussed, highlights how complex climate change is and how much we need a really interdisciplinary approach to the solution. And also, we can't just depend on the government. We can't just depend on scientists. We need all hands on deck. And that means that just all of us as community members have to support each other in our efforts. So I want to reiterate that Clio, on our website under our advocacy, we have a little section called Action Alerts. And I've put the link there to the one for the Back Bay study. So I want to remind everyone, you have 1 week left to submit your comments. We've put some guiding talking points if you're not sure. There's lots of links to articles that can give you more information if you want to formulate your own comments. and you can, look at the recording from today and like see what was discussed. But it's really important because this is an opportunity here, almost $5 billion to bring dollars for resilience in our community, and we can maybe do it in a more holistic way. So your voice matters. I put also links to county commission and city commission websites where you can find out when the next meetings are. Typically, public comments open a few days before and close usually on the day of the meeting. You can submit them in writing, you can submit a video, you can call in your comment as well. And again, we update our action alerts on a regular basis. So it's an opportunity for you to take action in an easy way if you're not sure how to go about it. Sometimes it's a letter, all you have to do is sign it. But remember that you're not just one person working toward a final goal. All of us are working together, and there's lots of individuals, there's organizations, there's coalitions of organizations and individuals in this county that are working really hard to move the needle on climate change. So I recognize a lot of your names in today's participant list. Some of the names I'm not familiar with. I hope everyone enjoyed the discussion. And again, I'll be sending a follow-up email next week with all of this information, all of the links that I put in the chat, and any additional stuff that Alex and Mario would like to share with me. So any final thoughts, Mario or Alex, before we close out?
Thank you guys, and if you read the book, I hope you enjoy it. Please read the book.
Buy Mario's book, and if you read it and feel that you are so inclined, you can also subscribe to the Miami Herald to have more climate journalism happen.
Subscribe to the Herald before you buy my book, please.
Yeah, support local journalism. Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll be in touch soon.
Good evening.
Have a good night.